Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Matt Warner, president of Atlas Network. I'm very excited about today's conversation. We have with us two people who represent movements that I've been really studying and learning a lot about and getting inspired by. So I'm excited for you, if you don't know them already or know what they're up to, for you to learn a little bit more. To frame our conversation today, I wanted to first acknowledge that if you follow Deirdre McCluskey, the great enrichment that, as an economic historian, she talks about, where from the mid-19th century to today, we've seen a 3,000% increase in standard of living for the global community. And of course, if you look more recently at the data on extreme poverty, since 1990, we've seen a precipitous drop from close to 2 billion to less than 800 million. In that time period. Of course, now with the pandemic, some of those people who have escaped extreme poverty, that is defined as living on $1.90 a day, are at risk of slipping back. The World Bank estimates as many as 150 million people, for example. And of course, poverty is not just in the most difficult parts of the world. People experience it here in the United States, certainly with many obstacles in their way. So today is a conversation about how to think about and what we've learned about trying to do something to accelerate that amazing decline. And the key piece of that great enrichment, why did that happen? And of course, there was a lot of theories about the Industrial Revolution and capital accumulation, but really at its core, I'm persuaded, is the innovation that came because of a new shared understanding of human dignity. And I think today we use the term human dignity without fully understanding all the implications. It is much more than a respect for all people. That is part of it. But it's also a deep recognition that every person has self-sovereignty and autonomy, and they have particular knowledge that no academic or technocrat has or can collect, and that knowledge is critical for discovering the solutions that are going to lift people up. And so the question becomes how to unleash that knowledge. Hernando de Soto talked about a great amount of dead capital in the world as a result of poor property rights systems. The poor of the world are sitting on $1 trillion in dead capital. Well, throughout the world, people living in poverty, when they are constrained by bad government policy and other things that we try to do to help them, that represents a great deficit, a great amount of knowledge capital that we all suffer from being excluded from society and the marketplace. And so this is behind very much why we launched this year Dignity Unbound, our project to support local think tanks who are working to unleash that knowledge among their populations as a solution to low-income communities' challenges. And so there are a lot of important things to learn about that. And I, as I mentioned, have been inspired by a couple of organizations, and I wanted to, at the jump here, highlight two books that I recommend to you. One is from the founder of the Family Independence Initiative, and we'll hear from their current CEO, Jesús Gerena, in a minute. This book is a very practical, on the ground understanding of human dignity that helps us see the potential and the decentralized nature of poverty solutions. And then I also wanted to bring to your attention, this is coming out on November 17th, Believe in People by Charles Koch and Brian Hooks. And I'm pleased to share with you that if you go on Amazon and order this book, you can order it now and it'll be delivered on its release date, November 17th. Stand Together has graciously agreed for every book that you buy, if you use the promo code ATLAS, they will donate $30 to Atlas Network. So very much appreciated there, and that's a win-win because this will be very much worth your attention. So now let me introduce today's experts. We have Will Dowell, who leads poverty strategy at Stand Together. And we also have Jesús Gerena, who is the CEO of Family Independence Initiative. And you're going to hear more about what both of these individuals do. I'll just mention that they both have a deep background in working on the ground with communities with low income. So they bring a great deal of real world experience on these issues. And I think what's important about that, when I think about the opportunities that the think tank community has here in the US in particular, is that we have an opportunity to amplify and become more authentically knowledgeable about the challenges for low-income communities. And that is going to take some work. It's going to take some reaching out. So with that, let me start with Jesús. Thanks for joining us, Jesús. I very much appreciate it. Tell us, from your experience and your work with Family Independence Initiative, what is it that in the last 50 years we've been doing wrong as a society when it comes to proactive efforts to try to lift up people in low-income communities?
Sure, and thank you, Matt, and the Atlas Network for having me and joining Will in this important conversation. So first is everything we know about poverty is wrong. We talk about that since the war on poverty was launched, we have built a deficit-based system to be able to look at the issue of those living in poverty and how to best support them. And what often happens is that we are looking at what they're lacking. We have also built a narrative about that they're lazy, that they're stuck, that they're really not motivated to try to do better, when the opposite is true. And so we've built this deficit-based system between government and philanthropy. It's $400 billion strong. And the truth is that actually people who are struggling and living in poverty are working really hard to do better. And the best stat that I can share to demonstrate that is a 2017 census study that showed of the 40 million at that time who were at or below the federally defined poverty line at 24,000. Within a 4-year period of time, 75% of them will actually move above that poverty line, in spite of that system that I just shared with you. And so what that indicates is that there's great initiative, creativity, ingenuity happening, and motivation to try to get above and do better, right? And sustain that mobility. Unfortunately, they can't do that fast enough. And an emergency happens, a kid gets sick, a car breaks down, and they fall back in. So within 5 years, 50% will fall back in. And those are the vicious cycles of poverty that we continue to see, that people are moving in and out, that from the outside, if you're not looking and learning, it seems like people are stuck there, when the truth, again, is very different. And we continuously look to bring top-down solutions, as well as look at what's missing rather than what's there.
So Will, tell us a little bit about Stand Together and how you have arrived at, what you've concluded has been wrong about what we've been doing.
Yeah, and agree with Jesús, Matt. We're glad to be here and glad to be with Atlas. I absolutely agree with Jesús. I think we have focused on the deficits of people and have not acknowledged, as you mentioned at the beginning, Matt, about the dignity. And it's more than just, oh, people are good. It's that people are capable and people have ingenuity and innovation. And I think that's really where we've been missing. We've treated poverty like an income problem, and poverty is an innovation problem that needs to be worked on as a group. And so I think our work at Stand Together is really is multifaceted, because poverty is multifaceted, but we really want to elevate and champion the capability of people. And I think when I look at what's wrong with how we've addressed poverty, and I agree with everything Jesús said, I would add we've got a marketplace, an ecosystem really of social assistance that has designed itself around the wrong customer. Instead of positioning people who are experiencing issues of poverty as the customer, what we've done is we've treated funders often like the customer, and the organization seeking to help treats that funder in that way. And then in so doing, the individual really becomes a problem to be solved, and ultimately a means to an end, even with good intentions. But if we take the individual and we put them back in the center, we honor their dignity, their capability, their ingenuity, then we're able to treat them rightly. And then funders can become really investors in a return on investment that is tied to the achievement of the individual. And the social organization trying to help is really more so responding to demand and providing access to opportunities based upon what the customer is deeming most necessary. But it starts with a belief in people. And if we don't really believe in people, we will move to a deficit-based approach like Jesús was mentioning.
So Jesús, you mentioned the problem with top-down solutions and the tendency that we all have when we see a problem and we feel compassion and we want to help, that we should do something and that we know what to do. When you gain appreciation for the limitations of that approach, what does that leave you with? What do you do instead? Tell us more about how you have internalized these lessons and yet still have a proactive approach to make a difference in the world.
Sure. Yeah, so I share often. I came in from, I did community organizing for about 10 years in Boston, and came into social justice work specifically because I wanted to solve some of these world problems, right? And especially here in the United States. And when I met Mauricio, the author of The Alternative and founder of FII, one of the things that he led with was you don't have to carry that burden. Actually, people know exactly how they can overcome their current positions. And if they don't, they know somebody who can, right? And that there's somebody in their social network, in their community, who is overcoming the very challenges that they're trying to overcome. And so, as I learned about our strength-based approach, it's centered on 3 key principles. First is that people are able, and that dignity and putting and that respect back in the hands of people, as well as the choice, who are closest to the problem in proximity, have and are developing solutions every day. And so for us to turn that back over to them and follow their lead is critical. 2 is the value of community and social networks. That if you strengthen the relationships around your neighborhood, around your community, as challenges and opportunities come about, is the way that you're going to be able to sustain success and thrive. And that is evident over and over again in this country. And I would imagine that if we were to go around this Zoom meeting, most folks could describe a critical relationship in their lives that really helped them make a connection, a critical connection, or critical access to a resource that really changed their lives. And then the third is to invest in that, is that rather than continuously thinking about, right, those top-down solutions and programming, that as people are sharing and crowdsourcing solutions for themselves and developing a way out and taking that initiative, that we should unrestricted cash investment back into their hands and trust that they are knowing best in how to make those investment back in whatever aspect of their households that they like. So we've been doing that now for almost 20 years, and I've been personally involved in the organization for the last 10 years. And, coming back to that first question, it's sort of like you're ruined after that. When you realize the human potential and the ability of people to be able to do well for themselves. And I've never sat down in a room with any member of our platform and our work who can't describe something that they're trying to do better for themselves. And when you take that lens into it, it breaks down barriers, and you get to see you don't have to carry that burden anymore.
Yeah, that's really striking. I mean, who better incentivized to better their life than they are? And so you can certainly take a back seat and look to them and their leadership in that way. I was really struck by something very profound in in Mauricio's book, where that idea of social capital gets oversimplified in the public debate around the way people can get ahead, and the typical debate is, well, you have some who say, like, well, people of privilege use social capital and that's how they get ahead, and so that's not fair, and so people in low income are at a deficit. And then you would have others who would say, well, that's not my problem. But what I think Mauricio helps us see is that social capital is, in fact, important in people of means, but so is it in low-income communities as well. It's just as important, and that we can sometimes undermine the social capital that is building if we create our own ties where they become dependent on us and they don't pursue that sort of local evolution. Will, tell us more specifically about how Stand Together is investing. What is it that you're doing? I know that you have a relationship with Jesus's organization. What's the scope of this, and what are some of the things that you feel are giving you encouragement?
Yeah, great question, Matt. We want to drive social sector innovation, and to do so by making investments in organizations like Jesus's, like FII, the kinds of investments that are going to drive disruption in the sector, that are community-based solutions, and that ultimately they're making poverty easier to escape and not easier to endure. I think that's a key distinction. I think we've largely made poverty easier to endure, right? It's gotten more comfortable, but that's not the point, right? We asked anybody on this call, hey, let's make it easier to endure. Everyone would say, well, that's not really what we're going for here. Well, but we do want to make poverty easier to escape. And so I think we're looking at a number of solutions that are very much like what Jesus is describing. And how do we go about making sure that the dignity of people is upheld, and that's really our focus. And then I'd say also, we want to recognize that poverty is a multi-dimensional issue. The paths out of poverty are as unique as the people who are in poverty. And so to come in and say, this is the way out, is not accurate. We've got to honor geography, we've got to honor culture, we've got to honor a number of different factors that people are facing, that are both internal and external. So we break it down: personal, structural, and cultural barriers. And so that leads us to invest in a number of issues, from criminal justice reform to workforce development and on, because they're all overlapping and interrelated. So I think multidimensional nature of things is key here. And then maybe the last thing I'd say, Matt, is we want to invest in strategies that recognize not just the dignity of somebody who's trying to get out of poverty, but also the connection that is needed to others in general, right? So it's really comes down to the difference between distribution strategy versus a co-production strategy, right? And which one I choose is ultimately tied to what the outcome is, and some other factors. We're not looking at distribution strategies. I'm not saying they're bad. I think there's a time and place for one. If someone's going to die in 3 days of starvation, we should distribute food immediately, right? This is not to discount distribution strategies, but for poverty, although you may need distribution initially to stop a crisis from happening, ultimately co-production is what's going to lead to someone getting out of this, and that's where social capital is so important. But we've got to be able to work together, innovate together, and recognize the dignity in one another, and the innovation that we can bring to bear when we come together. And so co-production, I think, is the kinds of strategies we're looking for, which FII does beautifully.
Yeah, speaking of which, social capital and networks, I mean, the importance of networks and these ties can't be underestimated. And we have a question here in the chat that says, how do you guys see, or what has been your response to the pandemic? And I believe I read, and you can correct me, Jesus, but I think you led the charge to team up with Stand Together to raise, I believe, $61 million this year. And you know, it's great to hear when a lot of money is raised, but you never really know where it's going. Because of the networks that you've created, you have these relationships with these individuals. You had a way to get cash assistance directly to those, and you knew who really needed it and could make good use of it. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So when the pandemic hit, we started getting calls from a few partners who knew that our online platform, and you all can visit it as I put on the chat, uptogether.org. It's based on those three key principles, and it's really connecting directly with those who are living in poverty, and just above, right? And connecting with one another. So there's a social capital component, as well as it gives us the ability to directly invest in people. And then that work, as these partners already knew us, they asked whether or not we could accelerate our distribution of cash, because they knew that people who are going to be affected economically by the pandemic were going to need it. And so we reached out to Stand Together and asked them if they would join us in launching a national campaign with a modest goal of just $10 million. And at the end of March, to date, we've raised just over $100 million. Actually,
I shortchanged you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, 110, and was even what makes me really proud, as well as that, to your point, is that we've worked with 200 organizations through the Stand Together Catalyst Network to be able to easily deploy those dollars directly to people. And so 94 million of that 110 million has already gone out the door in a period of time. And it really speaks volumes to what happens, right? When you work within networks and you really leverage those who have those connections inside of communities. Whether it's a nonprofit, we work with individuals as well who have the credibility to be able to connect with others, or non-NGOs, as whether it's a community group, a church group, whatever the case may be, to go far and wide and hit every state in the country as well as Puerto Rico during this time. And the other piece that I would also say is that it has helped tremendously, and this happens also right inside of our own networks, built a huge amount of our credibility inside of the sector. So initially, we were led by a lot of philanthropic support. That first half of those dollars came through that. But as local governments were beginning to think about how to respond to the pandemic with their CARES dollars, they realized everything that Will just said. It's like, yeah, we could try to mobilize and buy groceries or pay directly landlords the rent so that we could alleviate some of these pressures. Or we could just trust people and put the dollars directly in their hands so that they can figure out how to best utilize their resources as their own cash flow decrease and be able to overcome the moment as best as possible. And so it's kind of cool to have these conversations now with municipalities and cities when they're like, oh, could you help us like get dollars directly into the hands of a landlord? It's like, no, you don't want to do that. And actually that's against our values. What you want to do is to make it quick and flexible so that people can react on their own. And actually, when you do that, that is how you're going to have the most impact inside of the communities you're looking to be able to support.
Well, and let me turn to you, Will, because one of the principles that I hope I get this right, and you can correct me, at Stand Together is that a big problem may not need a big solution. And I think why that's so important to point out is that we're actually very tempted, if you think in the broad, not just here in the US, but in the aid and development space, there's a lot of talk historically about what's the missing ingredient, what's the one thing that we can do, or what are the four things that if we just do these things, then we're going to take care of everyone's problem. I think the challenge, when you realize the folly of that there's a lot of, even though it's well-intentioned, it is arrogant, right, to say, I know what that community needs. The challenge then is, okay, so it's going to be idiosyncratic. It's going to be, different and messy. Well, and that's why it becomes so important to redefine the role of the philanthropist and the organizations that are trying to help. And that's helped inform our grant making to local NGOs. They tell us what the priorities are. They tell us how they're going to define success. If we start getting into that prescription, we're muddying those waters. And so talk to us a little bit about how you would, what advice you would give. I mean, if we think about today's audience, and we have about 5 minutes left, and I just want to get to some practical advice around, we have think tanks who work on public policy, and we have academics, and we have philanthropists. And I'd love to just learn from both of you what advice you would have for either, you know, one of these groups or all three of these groups. What can we start doing differently? And I think it starts with, for example, think tanks really diversifying their own networks of who they're talking to and what other organizations working on low-income community issues, and listening and learning. Tell us what you would have folks do next.
Thank you, Matt. So much to say, and I'll be brief because I want to hear Jesus's answer too. I think we've got to recognize here that, you know, welfare is a choice, right? People choose to get on welfare. It's not being forced upon them. And because that's the best option often, that's why it's chosen. And if we want to be able to compete with that, we've got to flood the market with better alternatives. We've got to enhance and increase the number of innovative social entrepreneurs out there who are tackling issues of poverty. Because if we're going to compete, we've got to take back some of the market. And I think FII is doing that and doing it very well. And I think they're demonstrating to you why people are choosing, oh, well, I'm going to FII. And I can just tell you from firsthand experience, people who are on welfare are not proud of it. There's jabbing back and forth between people in communities saying, well, you're on welfare, you get a check and I don't. It's not a proud thing. And so, but if you don't provide an alternative, it's often the only thing. We've got to have compelling alternatives that can compete if we want to be able to crowd out the space. And then I think we've got to invest in thought leadership. It's super important to do that. We've got to get the paradigm that people must be in the center, that people are capable, into academia, but also into policymaking. And we've got to make decisions that way. And then I think I'd say two other things. The distinction between the type of approach you use to solve a problem. I mentioned two earlier, distribution versus co-production. I think we've got to better understand that, because we're often choosing the wrong approach to solve the right problem. So again, distribution works in some cases, but it's an approach we're using to solve an innovation problem, and you just can't do it that way. You need co-production. And then I'd say we've got to activate people in partnership with one another because of the co-production piece. But I'll stop because I want to hear Jesus.
All right, Jesus, 60 seconds. What should this audience do next?
Yeah, I think just from that perspective, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that there is a huge amount of just deficit-based data. There's not strength-based data. And I would ask that you begin to concentrate in really lifting what is going right inside of communities, what homegrown solutions are happening. Those are the ones that are going to have the quickest and most lasting impact inside of any community who is living in poverty. And it starts by centering your learning based on those individuals who have the proximity and lifting the lessons. And from that way, all of a sudden, what you're going to get is a whole bunch of new questions that you want to be able to answer and pursue. And I think that fundamental shift is going to begin to, and growing that field, so that 10, 20 years from now, we can talk about a strength-based field as much as we have this deficit-based field is what's going to change this in the long term.
And what a mind shift that is. Mauricio's book led me to a book called The Power of Positive Deviance. And so people who want to find out more about what Jesus is referring to here in terms of, you find solutions not by looking for weaknesses, you look for strengths, and then you try to facilitate the diffusion of those innovations across the network. And so it's really a fascinating way to start rethinking a lot of the things that we're doing to support others. But I just want to thank both Will and Jesus, not just for being with us today, but for serving as a source of great inspiration and also thought leadership to really give us some challenges. I strongly believe that those who are partnered with Atlas Network in the US are really well positioned to become authentic champions even more authentic champions of low-income communities and removing the barriers that artificially prevent them from discovering those enduring solutions that'll lift them up. We know that they're capable. We know that they know more than we do about their lives and their trade-offs. And so it's just a matter of unleashing that knowledge and that potential. So go to dignityunbound.org, go get the book, Believe in People. Again, if you use the Atlas code, use the promo code Atlas, Stand Together was kindly agreed to or offered to donate $30 to Atlas Network, and we'll be kicking off immediately in our next session, if you go back to your agenda, with our Leonard Liggio lecture. Thank you, Will and Jesus.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
Same here.